Coming up this week on the GCN Racing News Show, we have a new revised racing calendar. We will take a look at those dates and chat to Tom Steels and Wout Van Aert about their thoughts. We've also got some seriously epic charity rides by pro riders. First up, cycling's governing body, the UCI, announced last week what they described as the broad lines of what a revised 2020 racing calendar could look like. The announcement was a bit of a mixture of hard dates and vague ideas. What the UCI were prepared to put dates on were the Tour de France, which remains a full 3 weeks. That will now be starting on the 29th of August and finishing on the 20th of September. The World Championships will remain on the same date as they were planned, so the 20th to the 27th of September. And then the various national championships will now take place the weekend before the start of the Tour, so on the 22nd and 23rd of August. Other plans announced by the UCI include holding the Giro d'Italia after the World Championships, which would then be followed by the Vuelta a España. And that all 5 Monument Classics would take place this season, but on dates still to be defined. The UCI also said that a full revised men's and women's calendar will be announced no later than May the 15th. In the meantime, there has been plenty of speculation, as you can imagine, as to how the UCI are going to fit so many race days into such a short period of time, and also at a stage when the season would normally be winding down. Now, late last week, the French newspaper L'Equipe published what they thought would be reasonable dates for the Grand Tours, and then separately, the Belgian newspaper Het Nieuwsblad seemed to be reporting new dates for the monuments as though they'd been decided already. Now, in combining these two news sources, along with the dates that the UCI did give us, here is what a speculative race calendar would look like. Now, with any attempt to stuff 3 Grand Tours into the back end of a racing season, there are bound to be clashes with other races. Taking this calendar as our example, there are several clashes which riders and teams would not normally have to deal with. Firstly, the last day of the Tour de France overlaps with the first day of the World Championships, which is scheduled to be the men's individual time trial. And rather bizarrely, considering these are 2 races which the UCI have actually provided the dates for, they've also said the world's race schedule will not be changing, which means that any rider wishing to complete the Tour won't be able to compete for the World Time Trial rainbow jersey unless they pull out of the Tour de France early. So that is not news that the likes of Tom Dumoulin, Primož Roglic or Chris Froome really want to hear. Now, another major obvious clash here is that the Giro d'Italia overlaps with the Vuelta a España, so nobody will be able to take part in both of those races. The Tour of Flanders and Liège-Bastogne-Liège would also take place during the Giro, while the Tour of Lombardy will be smack bang in the middle of the Vuelta. There's certainly a lot of high-level racing to pack into a short period of time, and late last week we caught up with Tom Steels, Sports Director of De Koning Quick-Step, to find out his thoughts.
Yeah, I think we have to race, that's for sure. We cannot cancel the race for the whole season. I mean, especially for everybody. The teams itself to survive. It's not so easy if we are a sponsored sport, so we have to give something back to the sponsors. I think also for the public, it's very hard all over the world, and sport is like also a theater. They give people a lot of pleasure to look at races. So let's give them also something back to look forward to. It's still gonna take a long time, I think, but at least let's give the people also some amusement, and that's probably maybe also a good reason why we should race. At the end, if any date they're gonna give the classics, it's always gonna be a good race. It's gonna be strange, that's for sure, but it's gonna be a good race. It's just the thing that you have to think about it. This season gets really long, then we get into the next season, so maybe we are gonna be racing for a year and a half. That's also something to consider. But we just have to let the races go on and just we make the puzzle with the riders to get them ready. And for sure, it's going to be a hell of a race, though.
I don't think many of us would be that disappointed if there was a season and a half all in one go, given how starved we're going to be of racing for much of this year. Now, there has been no mention by the UCI so far of the races which would have occupied these late slots on the calendar and which could now be somewhat hijacked by the presence of the Tour de France. For example, the Tour of Britain and then the 2 Canadian one-day races in Quebec and Montreal. The promoters of the Tour of Britain have said that the new Tour de France dates are a slap in the face for the race and that they were not consulted about these new dates beforehand. There has also been no mention by the UCI of the women's races that have all been postponed due to the coronavirus, and it appears that they yet again are a bit of an afterthought for the UCI. The Cyclists Alliance, which is the body that represents female pro cyclists, sent an open letter to the UCI last week requesting to be involved as they formulate a new women's racing calendar. We will put a link to that letter in the description down below. Now, I should stress, once again, that most of those dates are simply speculation at this point in time, as the UCI continues to work with various race organisers to confirm dates for as many races as they possibly can. However, confirm seems a rather optimistic word to be using at the moment, because ultimately all of these dates, no matter what the UCI decide, will be dependent on the various government restrictions which may or may not remain in place at that point. Then there is the fact that we don't know whether international travel is going to be feasible for riders to actually get to the races in the first place. Presumably, staging both the Giro and the World will be greatly complicated by the fact they are both planned to have foreign starts, which means even more international travel. So the Giro d'Italia, for example, is due to start in Hungary, whilst the Vuelta is due to get underway in the Netherlands. Although there are rumours that both will forego those opening stages and that they will not be replaced by extra stages in the home country. Further to all of that, even if technically and legally these races could take place on the proposed date, there does remain a question of whether or not they should. As a cycling fan though, the prospect of all these races coming thick and fast in the space of 3 or 4 months is really quite exciting. But on a human level, there remains plenty of trepidation. We simply don't know what the world will be like in August when racing is currently due to resume. One major problem with the proposed dates by the UCI could be the idea of holding the national championships just 1 week before the Tour de France. With the shadow of coronavirus still hanging over these races, the prospect of hundreds of riders and staff spreading themselves across Europe to take part in their national championships before reconvening in Nice for the start of the Tour de France is probably not the type of behaviour that would be condoned by a chief medical officer. However, if various governments decide to allow sporting events such as bike races, and these races do take place, there may be opportunity for some sporting achievements which will pique the interest of certain riders. So the double of the Giro d'Italia and the Tour de France is seen as one of the most difficult things to achieve in the sport of cycling. It's only been done by the absolute greats in our sport, and it hasn't been done since 1998. In recent years, as riders hone their form more and more specifically for certain races, it's seen as too much of an ask to keep the form required from the start of the Giro right to the end of the Tour. And conversely, it's not long enough to peak, then take a recovery period, and then try and peak again. Now, in a normal year, the gap from the start of the Giro to the end of the Tour de France is 78 days. In an Olympic year, which this should have been, it's slightly shorter at 71 days. However, on the revised calendar we showed earlier, the gap could now potentially be just 57 days, with the Giro starting just 13 days after the Tour de France ends. There could be some riders looking at this prospect and considering a genuine possibility to hold their form for that long and join the greats like Eddy Merckx and Bernardino in achieving the Giro Tour double, or in this case, the Tour Giro double. It's reminiscent in fact of when the Vuelta used to take place back in the spring before it was moved to its current slot in 1995. Back then, there was even less time between the end of the Vuelta and the start of the Giro d'Italia, sometimes only 3 days. As was the case in 1981, when amazingly, Giovanni Battaglin won both races. Taking into account rest days and split stages, he raced 46 Grand Tour stages in 48 days. Eddy Merckx did the same in 1973, on that occasion racing 43 Grand Tour stages in 43 days, winning 12 of them and winning both races overall. Times are different now of course, but it'll be interesting to see if anybody makes that an aim for themselves this year. On the other hand, you'd imagine teams will be trying to spread the racing amongst their roster of riders who will all be keen to pin a number on as much as possible at the end of this year. It also could be possible to win the Giro d'Italia and Il Lombardia on the same week, something never possible before because both races have always held their slots in the calendar, the Giro in May and the Tour of Lombardy at the end of the season, the race of the falling leaves. Quite the prospect I think, particularly for the Italian riders and not least Vincenzo Nibali, who will be aiming to win both of them for a third time. So, There we have it, a potential new calendar for cycling. But do you think it'll actually happen? You can let us know by taking the poll over on the GCN app, a link to which you can find on your screen right now. Will there be any pro road racing in 2020? Yes or no? It's a simple question. Speaking of polls, last week we asked you whether you thought Mathieu van der Poel would have finished in the top 10 of Paris-Roubaix last Sunday. So 41% of you thought he'd finish on the podium, another 41% thought he'd have finished in the top 10, 14% of you thought he'd have won the thing, and just 4% of you thought he'd finish outside the top 10. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll get to find out for real before the end of this year. Meanwhile, we decided to check in with his arch nemesis, Wout Van Aert, to get his take on the cycling season as it stands right now.
At some point you want some certainty, or you want some perspective. For the Spring Classics, like I said, it was a big relief that finally, okay, now everything is cancelled. I don't have to count on something anymore. So it's a bit the same for the Tour de France, but today I read a quote from my teammate, from Tom Dumoulin, and he said now at this point he'd rather have the uncertainty when the tour will be than the certainty that the tour will not be this year. And I think that says how I feel. Like, I don't feel comfortable that I don't know when the start will be, but I will not feel comfortable at all when you know that there will be not a start this year. For some reason it sounds good, like, okay, let's let it go this year, and for me, focus on cross, for example, and go to next season. But on the other hand, these are a lot of months without any goal or any entertainment. So I hope it will be faster than that.
In other news, we have had a few epic charity fundraising rides over the last week. Geraint Thomas of Team Ineos put in 3 12-hour shifts on the indoor trainer on consecutive days to raise funds for the NHS. His Just Giving page currently sits at over £350,000. Meanwhile, former pro cyclist Molly Weaver decided to ride outdoors in her back garden. She recreated the distance of the Dirty Reaver, which she was supposed to be competing. That meant 130 kilometres or 1,300 laps of her garden. Bonkers, but thoroughly worthwhile, as she's raised over £12,000 for Women's Aid so far. Willie Smits of Burgos BH arguably went a step further with the epicness of his ride. It took him 37 hours and he burnt well over 15,000 calories on his way to riding 1,000 kilometres on Zwift. Fair play, Smit was raising money for the development of cycling over in South Africa. Giulio Ciccone of Trek Segafredo climbed a total of 10,000 metres in one sitting on Zwift, and it took him 12 hours of riding. Over in the US, Emma Grant of Team 2020 Everested Mount Lemmon over in Tucson, raising over $8,000 for No Kid Hungry. Absolutely fantastic to see so many pros using their newfound spare time for something very worthwhile indeed. And finally, Bianchi has been named as the official bike of the Giro d'Italia. The familiar Celeste Green will now be seen atop Shimano neutral service cars, not just at the Giro, but also at other RCS Sport races, such as Strada Bianca and Milano San Remo. Right, that is all for this week's GCN Racing News Show. Don't forget to download the GCN app if you haven't done so already. I'll be back tomorrow with Si for the GCN show, and I'll see you then.